part of the Press Play Podcast Network.
Hello and welcome to the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. I am your host, Ben Billman, and I am so excited for a new year of college basketball. The 2024-25 season is right around the corner. Teams have started to practice, and we are just weeks away from seeing the games starting. It should be an incredible year with the amount of changes, the amount of transfers, incomers to new situations. The coaching carousel was crazy over the offseason, and so I think we are headed for one of the most exciting and exhilarating seasons in college basketball history. In this episode, there are two main categories that I want to focus on. First of all, in the first half of the show, looking at some of the conference realignment, who is going where, and what those schools will have as far as an impact on their new locations. And in the second half, I want to look at the power conferences and list off who I think are the top 5 teams in each of those conferences, along with the mid-majors and who I think are the top 5 mid-major schools heading into this year. So let's get started. First of all, it was a wild and crazy offseason in college basketball, in college sports in general. The conference realignment carousel took place over the summer, and we've seen with the start of college football how some of these changes have impacted the landscape of the college football world. One thing, though, that hasn't really been taken a look at yet is how these changes will impact college basketball. From a standings standpoint to rankings overall, and eventually the impact that these changes will have on which teams make it to the NCAA tournament in March. So first of all, we need to talk about the Pac-12, or the death of the Pac-12, if you want to look at it that way. Unfortunately, over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, the Pac-12 has basically disintegrated from being one of the most historic, one of the most championship-laden conferences in college sports to now basically being non-existent. Now, I will save that discussion here in a little bit for what is going to happen to the Pac-12. That is still in the works and remains to be seen, but it does look like potentially the Pac-12 could return just with a whole new set of teams. And so that is something to keep an eye on as we look towards the future. But as of right now, the Pac-12 has disintegrated, and 10 of those 12 schools have landed in different spots for college football purposes. The other 2, at least for the short term, have landed in a different spot for college basketball purposes. So first of all, looking at the Pac-12 schools that transferred to the Big 12, and there were 4 of them. The first one being Arizona, the second one being Colorado, and then also Utah and Arizona State. Now, at one point, Colorado and Utah were actually members of the Big 12. Then they went to the Pac-12, and now they're coming back. So what kind of impact will those 4 schools have on the quality and just the overall feel of the Big 12? Well, in my opinion, the Big 12 conference is the deepest when it comes to college basketball. When you have schools like Kansas, Houston, Baylor, Iowa State, 4 teams that I think going into this year feel like a conference championship and a national championship are both on the realistic goal side of things. You're looking at adding depth with the inclusion of Arizona, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona State. If I had to pick one of those schools, though, that I believe that could come in and immediately change the scope and scale of the Big 12, it has to be Arizona. The Wildcats have been in the tournament almost every year over the past few years, and they look like a team that can compete for a Big 12 championship from day one. I would not put it past Tommy Lloyd, the head coach. He has built a very stable and successful program at Arizona, and they are definitely going to finish in the top 4 or 5 of the Big 12. Do I think they can win it? Probably not. I think there will be some growing pains and some transition struggles for Arizona, but overall, of the 4 Pac-12 schools moving to the Big 12, I think Arizona will have the cleanest move and the one that does not take away from the success they've had in the past. Now, when it comes to Colorado, Utah, and Arizona State, I don't want to say that it's going to be a hard realignment transition, but with the depth of the Big 12, I'm very afraid that those 3 schools are going to get stuck in the middle of the pack and maybe overlooked. I do not see, at least at this point, any of those 3 schools advancing to the NCAA tournament, and possibly, I don't even know if any of them will be in the discussion for the NCAA tournament. Now, Colorado, Utah, and Arizona State, all 3 have had success in the past, and so it's not out of the ordinary or unlikely that they can be successful in the Big 12. But the middle of the pack in the Big 12, which includes Cincinnati, Texas Tech, Kansas State, BYU, those type of schools, can Colorado, Utah, and Arizona State, are they comparable? Or would they fall just outside of that group and fall into the bottom third or so of the Big 12? So Arizona, I believe, will make a fairly smooth transition. Colorado, Utah, and Arizona State could struggle in their first year in the Big 12. Moving on to the Big 10. Now, if you remember back a handful of years ago, the Big 10 was the first piece that decided we are going to add some Pac-12 schools, and this was the beginning of the end for the Pac-12 when Oregon, UCLA, Washington, and USC all decided to jump ship and move to the Big 10. This expanded the Big 10's reach to the Pacific Coast, to the West Coast time zone, and now they have a border-to-border, sea-to-sea conference that spans all the time zones, and hopefully that leads to success overall and definitely a bigger paycheck for all the Big 10 schools. So for basketball, what does this mean for the Big 10? Well, it's going to be an interesting year in the Big 10. At this point, and I know this is very early to say, but I don't see a team in the Big 10 that is going to compete for a national championship. I know that's probably a hot take, and I know it's probably one that will change as the year goes on. But right now, we had Purdue make it to the national championship last year. They lose Zach Edey, the 2-time National Player of the Year. And outside of Purdue, there really is nobody left that has a lot of experience and players that have been there, done that. I'm a little bit afraid that the Big 10 might be in for a tough season and maybe a down year when it comes to teams actually competing for a national championship. So what does that mean for these 4 Pac-12 teams that are coming over to the Big 10? Well, it probably means that they have a chance almost immediately to be impact teams in the Big 10. And the 2 that really stand out to me that I think will make a splash from day one are Oregon and UCLA. Oregon, of course, Dana Altman has built a very successful program. He is a coach whose teams get better and better as the year goes on, as they gain experience and confidence. And then, of course, UCLA, the most historic program, the most championships, moving into the Big 10 for basketball. Other than location, when it actually just comes to basketball, seems like a match made in heaven. I think Oregon and UCLA are both tournament teams. I think they will both finish in the top third of the Big Ten. The Big Ten has 18 teams now, so I see Oregon and UCLA finishing in that top 6. I think they're both going to be teams that head into conference season feeling like if things go the right way, we could win a conference championship. On the other hand, though, I think Washington and USC may be in for a tough season, at least this year. Washington has really struggled in recent years to find a footing in the Pac-12, and I think that continues in a Big Ten that maybe doesn't have the top teams that are national title contenders, but it might be one of the deeper conferences when it comes to teams competing for an NCAA tournament berth. Looking at teams like Rutgers, Illinois, Michigan State, Michigan, Ohio State, Iowa, there are a lot of teams in that mid-tier in the Big Ten, and I think Washington and USC might even fall below that and get caught in that depth and just the overall strength of the Big Ten. It's going to take Washington and USC a handful of years to recruit the right guys and get to the level where they can compete night in and night out against these physical, defensive-minded Big Ten teams. So 4 to the Big 12, 4 to the Big 10, 2 to the ACC. The ACC, as you all know, or maybe you don't know, stands for the Atlantic Coast Conference. As of right now, all the teams in the ACC are on the Atlantic Coast. Well, that has changed now because Cal and Stanford have joined the ACC. So when we talk about conference names that make absolutely no sense, you now have 2 Pacific Coast teams in the Atlantic Coast Conference, Cal and Stanford. Now, as much as these schools add for academic purposes and just overall name recognition, they really do not do much for any sports when it comes to football, basketball, or baseball. Stanford obviously is a school that succeeds across the board in a lot of Olympic sports. Cal has some of that as well. But when it comes to college basketball, it's very possible that Cal and Stanford both finish in the bottom 3 or 4 in the ACC this year. Now, I'm not saying that the ACC is going to be a highly successful conference. I don't even know if they're going to get 6 or 7 teams in the NCAA tournament, but what I do know is that Cal and Stanford have both been pretty poor when it comes to basketball over the last half decade or so, and that doesn't bode well for either of them when it comes to their first year in the ACC. So I think the ACC, it's going to take some time for those 2 programs to transition in. So the 4 to the Big 12, with Arizona probably being the most prominent and potential success in the Big 12. The Big 10 with 4 teams, with Oregon and UCLA having a chance to jump right in and find success early. And then the 2 teams in Cal and Stanford going to the ACC, but I don't see them having much of an impact overall. So 4 plus 4 plus 2, that's 10. That leaves 2 teams remaining from the Pac-12 and where they ended up. And those 2 schools are Oregon State and Washington State. 2 schools that have not had a high level of success recently in basketball, but both of them can claim moderate success in specific years since COVID hit in 2020. Oregon State making it to the Elite 8 in 2021, and then Washington State having a rebound year this past year. Their coach moving on and a couple other pieces transferring out, but a program that has found success. Now, both of these schools, even though the Pac-12 may be reforming, which I'll talk about here in just a minute, those 2 schools for the part-time right now will be in the West Coast Conference. The West Coast Conference, for all intents and purposes, is considered a mid-major conference. The two most prominent programs in the West Coast Conference that everyone around the world of college basketball knows, the two schools are Gonzaga and St. Mary's. Those two teams have been dominant over the last 20 years in this conference, and even though Oregon State and Washington State don't have the greatest traditions, they still have money, scholarships, facilities, and players that are at the Pac-12 level. So I could absolutely see Oregon State and Washington State walking in there. Maybe if the Pac-12 still existed, they would not be that great. But because they're moving to a conference where they could immediately be at the top half of the conference, I could absolutely see both of these teams competing for the NCAA tournament and being in that top tier with Gonzaga and St. Mary's. Now, as of right now, this is a 2-year commitment. Oregon State and Washington State moving to the West Coast Conference for basketball. But recently, actually over just the last handful of days, we have seen a major move when it comes to conference realignment, with the Pac-12 basically rising from the ashes and adding, as of right now, 5 teams: Boise State, Fresno State, Colorado State, San Diego State, and Utah State have all decided that beginning with the 2026 school year, the Pac-12 will now have 7 teams, including the Oregon State and Washington State moves as well. Those 5 teams that I just mentioned, they are all from the Mountain West Conference, all high mid-major programs. So that does leave into question, is the Pac-12 going to be considered a power conference once those 5 teams are added, and then they have 7 teams and the potential for more? That remains to be seen. Will they be considered a power conference or a mid-major conference? It heavily depends on these next 2 years and what those programs can do to build up their basketball situation between now and then. Now, just a note when it comes to the Pac-12, as of right now, they have 7 teams. In order to be recognized by the NCAA and be eligible to participate in NCAA tournaments, they have to have at least 8 teams. So the Pac-12 is not done yet. They need to add at least 1 more. More than likely, they need to add 2 or 3 more just to be safe. But that also means for the Mountain West, because they're losing all these teams, that they need to add some more teams in order to stay eligible for NCAA-sponsored events. It is a roller coaster that is nowhere near done, and Washington State and Oregon State could potentially survive all this mess, and the Pac-12 could actually re-exist in the near future. So that is something to keep an eye on. So those are the 12 Pac-12 teams and where they ended up here in the offseason, and an idea of where they could finish and how they could do in their first year in their new conferences. Now, these were not the only moves when it came to conference realignment. 3 other schools made major moves into other power conferences. First of all, Texas and Oklahoma both moved from the Big 12 to the SEC. Of those 2 schools, I think Texas could have an immediate impact when it comes to college basketball in the SEC, and I think more than likely they will make the NCAA tournament. They have a real chance to make a run at the SEC championship if things go well, and they're going to have an impact from day one. Oklahoma, I respect that program. I think they can build that program and get back to where they've been. But year one, I think, is going to be very difficult for Oklahoma. When you look at the depth of the SEC, they are right there with the Big 12 when it comes to quality teams, top to bottom. And unfortunately, I think Oklahoma is going to get caught in the weeds when it comes to that middle of the pack that includes schools like Mississippi, Florida, Kentucky, Mississippi State, Other schools in there as well. It's going to be tough for Oklahoma to break away and get into the upper echelon of the SEC from day one in their first year. And then finally, the last move when it came to conference realignment at the major level was SMU moving from the American Athletic Conference up to the ACC. Another interesting move for the ACC, adding a team from Texas, but SMU does have a lot of money. They have a good fan base, a good alumni base, and so SMU, hopefully over the next handful of years, can build up their sports programs to get to the ACC level, but I think they will struggle mightily in their first year playing in the ACC basketball conference. So those are the moves that have happened over the offseason. The Pac-12 absolutely disintegrated, but hopefully 2 years from now, we can look back and say it was for the best, and the new Pac-12 is better than ever. All right, let's take a quick break. When I come back, we're going to take a look at each of the major conferences and who I think are the top 5 teams in each of those conferences.
Hi, everybody. It's John Tellage from the Guardians of the Land MLB podcast. Be sure to hop on with us to follow all the dramatic developments of the reigning American League Central Division champions. From game analysis to interviews to keeping tabs on who could be the next breakout star. We'll have that and much, much more right here. It's the Guardians of the Land MLB podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. Subscribe here and join the fun.
What's up, everyone? I'm Holly Wetzel.
And I'm Tyrus Powell.
And we are your hosts of The Orange is Oranger, a Cleveland Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network. We give you all the dog pound coverage that you'll need to get you through the regular season, hopeful postseason, and I'd say off-season, Tyrus, but is there really ever an off-season for this team?
Thankfully for our podcast, Holly, there really never is when it comes to the Cleveland Browns. Don't miss our breakdown of each week's matchup, game recaps, and any and all news out of Berea to feed your Browns appetite. As we know, Holly, dogs gotta eat.
Yes, they do. So hit that subscribe button and never miss an episode of the Orange is Oranger, Cleveland Browns podcast on the Press Play Podcast Network.
Welcome back to the second half of the Full 40 College Basketball Podcast. Well, as I mentioned, this season is just kicking off. I've already seen a handful of teams that have started practices, getting those conditioning workouts in, and getting ready for the season. I have also seen a handful of exhibition games already put on schedules, and some of them actually look really exciting. Being here in Knoxville, Tennessee, the Tennessee Volunteers will play the Indiana Hoosiers in an exhibition game that I will be going to in just about a month, and so that is really exciting to see some of these major programs playing exhibition games against each other. They don't count, but they can give a good glimpse and idea of where these teams are going in to the non-conference and the preseason tournaments that take place all over the world, especially the holiday tournaments over Thanksgiving break. So it is a really exciting time to be a college basketball fan and seeing new faces in new places. The transfer portal, everything has settled down. The rosters are set. The coaching carousel is done, at least for right now, and we are ready for the start of the year. Now, as mentioned in the first half, the Pac-12 is no longer around. They will be back in 2026, but what used to be the Power 5 or the Power 6 when it came to college basketball is now down to only the Power 5. That would be the Big 12, the Big 10, the SEC, the Big East, and the ACC. So in the second half, we're going to take a look at each of those conferences and who I believe are the top 5 schools, top 5 teams in those conferences heading in to the 24-25 season. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that my opinions won't change as the year goes on, as teams start to develop, and as rosters start to take form. But as of right now, based on the production of players that are returning, the quality of transfers that have come into the program, and just the coaches either that have remained there or have come into the program, this is kind of a conglomeration of all of those things, and putting my opinion onto those based on where we are right now, about a month before the games begin. So I'm going to start in the Big East. The Big East has some of the best teams in the country. Obviously, Connecticut being the two-time national champion and will look to three-peat this year, which is definitely not out of the question. But outside of UConn, the Big East, I think, is going to have a tough time to find good depth in their conference. So when I was putting together my top 5, it was fairly easy to figure out my top 3. I think those will be Connecticut, Creighton, and Marquette. Those 3 schools, I think, have the staying power, the quality of coaching, and just the overall depth in their rosters to be successful. When it comes to where I could see these teams finish at the end of the year, I could definitely see Connecticut winning again. I think Creighton has Final Four aspirations, and Marquette could make a second weekend push to the Sweet 16. So those 3 choices were pretty easy, but beyond that, I really had to dig and search to figure out who else in this conference could compete and potentially make it to the NCAA tournament. And the only other teams I could see were Xavier and St. John's. Now, Xavier, Coach Sean Miller, I think he has the chance to build this program and be pretty successful. And then St. John's, we'll see. We'll see with Rick Pitino what he can do if he can continue to build this program and get them to the NCAA tournament. So in my opinion, the Big East at this point is a 3-horse race with Xavier and St. John's just outside, looking good for the tournament, but maybe not at that top tier level. Those are my top 5 in the Big East: Connecticut, Creighton, Marquette, Xavier, and St. John's, in that order, 1 through 5. We will definitely talk more about individual players and more outlooks on specific teams in future episodes, but right now I'm just going to focus on the overall teams and the order of rank that comes with those. Now, very similarly to the Big East, I think the ACC is in a very similar position in the sense that there are 1 or 2 teams at the top that have to feel very good and confident about competing at the highest level. But then after that, what happens? The ACC is a team at this point, or a conference at this point, that is dominated by Duke and North Carolina. I would put Duke at the top of that right now. An Elite 8 run last year. They did graduate some players, but they brought in one, if not the best, recruiting class in the country, with the biggest name in college basketball going into the season, Cooper Flagg, coming in as probably the number 1 pick projected in next summer's NBA draft. People have basically decided he is going to be the National Player of the Year based off what he has done up to this point in his career. So Duke I would have at number 1 in the ACC, with North Carolina being a very close second. The key name with North Carolina is RJ Davis, returning for his 5th year, final year. He may be the best point guard in the country, and North Carolina is going to be super tough. The top 2 spots were pretty easy in the ACC, but barring something that I have not yet seen, I don't know if there's any other team in the ACC that's going to be able to compete at that level. And so the teams I do have on my radar, though, if I had to pick 5 teams and I only have 2, the other 3 that I would put in there. Now, this one might sound crazy because of all the turmoil and all the changeover, but I would have to put Louisville in there. Louisville has done a phenomenal job rebuilding this program. Every single player transferred out over the offseason. Every single player on that roster is going to be new to Louisville and the Cardinals system. I think that could actually play in their favor, that they could have a rejuvenated roster with a new setting, new goals, fresh perspective, and I'm actually going to put Louisville as the third best team in the ACC. Now, maybe I'm crazy. Maybe I'll look back at the end of the year and say that was the worst take that I've ever made. But at this point, with the ACC being so wide open, why not Louisville? Why not have them be the third best team? Two other teams that I also think could be successful, but maybe not at the high level of making a Final Four run, but potentially getting to the Sweet 16, I would put Clemson and Miami. Clemson last year made it to the Elite Eight. Miami the year before made it to the Final Four. So both of those programs have seen success in recent years. It's not out of the realm of possibility that either of those programs can build upon that for the 24-25 season. And I think both of those programs should be in the top 5 in the ACC and be successful overall and get bids to the NCAA tournament. I think Brownell at Clemson and Larinaga at Miami are two of the higher level coaches in college basketball, and they deserve to get that respect and be considered near the top of the ACC going into this year. Okay, so the Big East and the ACC, those conferences are taken care of. Let's move now to the Big Ten. Now, the Big Ten is in an interesting predicament this season. They have the quality, they have the depth, but do they have championship contenders? For the last 25 years, the Big Ten has failed in winning a national championship. Michigan State won in 2000, and if you count Maryland, who is now a Big Ten school, but won the championship in 2002 as a member of the ACC, since then, the Big Ten has gone without a title. And as of right now, I do not see a team in the Big Ten that is going to compete for a national title. I do see a lot of teams, though, that Sweet 16 second weekend should be a goal, and their seasons would probably be a disappointment if they did not reach that goal. So it was very tough to come up with a top 5 for the Big Ten because I feel like there are about 10 or 11 teams that have a shot at that top 5. Two schools that I believe are almost locks for that top 5, though, are Purdue and Indiana. Purdue loses Zach Edey, and so the whole question with them is going to be, what does that team look like now that their post presence, their 20 points, 10 rebounds a game guarantee is now gone? Guard play is going to become that much more important for Purdue. But Matt Painter being one of the best coaches in the country, he'll figure it out. And I have Purdue as the number 1 team in the Big Ten. With Indiana a close second. Now, this does not take into consideration the struggles the Hoosiers had last year. This is all based on the potential of the transfers and the freshmen coming in to make a difference for this team. And I'll talk more about that team in a future episode. Beyond that, though, this is when it gets real interesting. I think UCLA has a real chance to be the third best team in the Big Ten. Being from the West Coast, being new to the conference, they have an opportunity, at least for 1 year, that their tendencies, their strategies, and overall abilities may not be able to be either understood or looked at and figured out by other teams in the Big Ten. They might have some time here before all the film is watched, all the tape is watched for them to succeed. I have UCLA as the number 3 team in the Big Ten. At number 4, again, this might be crazy, and this is based a lot on just potential and hope and dreams of the program. I'm going to put Michigan. Michigan, with the coaching change, Juwan Howard is now out. They bottomed out last year in the Big Ten, but with a new coach, new players, hopefully a new mindset, I think Michigan has a chance to get right up back to where they were under John Beilein and for the first year or two that Juwan Howard was the coach at Michigan. Watch out for the Wolverines. I have them at number 4 in the Big Ten. And then number 5, I'm going to put the Illinois Fighting Illini. Again, this is based on what they've done in the past. They had a very successful run to the Elite Eight last year. They got destroyed by UConn in the Elite Eight, but who didn't? And again, I just trust that coaching staff. I think they have built a program and a culture that is very tough to beat. So I'm going to put Illinois as the 5th best team in the Big Ten heading in to this season. Now to the 2 conferences which I think will dominate college basketball this year. And by that I mean when we look at the top 25 week after week, we are going to see more teams from these 2 conferences than any other conference in the country. And those 2 conferences, the Big 12 and the SEC. First of all, the Big 12. This one was difficult because, unlike the Big Ten, where there were no contenders for a national champion, the Big 12 has the potential to have 5 or 6 different teams compete for a national championship. So this was a very high level, tough discussion, hard for me to figure out who the top 5 are. But if I'm going to base it on the players, the coaches, and who they have returning, the top team has to be Kansas. With Hunter Dickinson coming back, that team stabilized, and some of the freshmen they've brought in, Kansas would be highly disappointed if they did not make it to the Final Four and potentially win a championship. And then also Houston, Kelvin Sampson will once again have one of the best defensive teams in the country, and they will be number 2 in the Big 12. At number 3, Iowa State, one of the surprise teams from last year. I think they'll be even better this year in the Big 12. At number 4, as I talked about in the first half, Arizona, moving over from the Pac-12, now in the Big 12. They're going to be the 4th best team in the Big 12 and have a real chance to get a really high seed in the NCAA tournament and make a good run or even win a national championship. And then finally, at number 5, I have Baylor. Scott Drew has one of the best teams in the country, and he may struggle to even be in the top 5 in his own conference. That's how good the Big 12 is this season. Now, having said that, I feel bad for leaving a couple teams out. I think Cincinnati, Texas Tech, Kansas State, BYU, all those schools I think are at a very high level and should be very successful, but the Big 12 is just so deep that there's just no room for them. So again, Kansas, Houston, Iowa State, Arizona, and Baylor are my top 5 in the Big 12. And then finally in the SEC, I would put them tied with the Big 12 as the best conference in college basketball this year. And at the top of the SEC, I would have the Final Four team from last year, Alabama, as the number 1 team in the conference. I think they have a real chance to repeat and get back to the Final Four. Mark Sears returning at point guard, along with RJ Davis. I would have them 1 and 2 or tied for first when it comes to best point guards in the country. And so I've got Alabama at number 1. At number 2, I have Auburn. Johnny Broome returning for the team. And a team in Auburn that you know is going to play hard, play good defense, score a lot. I have high hopes for the Auburn Tigers this season. At number 3, I have the Arkansas Razorbacks. John Calipari moving over from Kentucky to Arkansas. Completely redid this roster. Almost every single player on this roster is a transfer or an incoming freshman. But John Calipari has a way of bringing people together, bringing players together in a very short amount of time. He has a lot of talent, and it wouldn't surprise me if by March this is one of the best teams, if not the best team in the country, based on the talent and the skill level that they could have. At number 4, I've got Tennessee, an Elite Eight team from a year ago. Lost a lot of pieces, but also returned a lot of pieces and are bringing some nice pieces in. Rick Barnes has one of the most stable programs in the country right now that continually finishes in the top half of the SEC and is competing for NCAA tournament spots every single year. And then at number 5, I have Texas A&M. They're a team that struggled some last year, but I think they figure it out this year and are one of the best teams in the country and will be the 5th best team in the SEC. So Alabama, Auburn, Arkansas, Tennessee, and Texas A&M. And I feel bad for leaving out a couple other teams who I think are going to be very successful, but just did not make the cut. Those would be Mississippi, Florida, Texas, Kentucky, and even Mississippi State I would throw in there as well. Now, I did not make a top 5 for other conferences, but I do want to recognize a couple of their schools which I think will have very successful seasons, but are in mid-major conferences. As always, Gonzaga, the talent and the level of play, Mark Few will have his team in the top 5 all season. I think Memphis and St. Mary's both have a chance to be very successful. And then I think Boise State and Dayton are 2 other mid-major programs to keep an eye on outside of the Power 5 conferences. All right, so that is a look at, in the first half, looking at the Pac-12, the demise of that, and how those schools should do in their new conferences. And then the second half, looking at the Power 5 conferences and where I see the top 5 falling for each of those. I'm excited for the new year of college basketball. We are going to go over a gamut of different topics this year. I am just excited to kick it off. Thank you so much for joining me in the first episode of the 24-25 season, and I look forward to many more. Thank you for listening to the Press Play Podcast Network. To follow us on X, look up Press Play Pods. For sponsorship plans and more information, please email admin@pressplaypodcast.com. And to listen to all our shows and learn more about our network, please visit www.pressplaypodcasts.com.